This week's episode is slightly different as I thought I'd navigate through a topic that I find both fascinating and incredibly important, and that is the history of safeguarding here in the UK. My reasons for this are that I love history and I love safeguarding. So why not? It's easy to think of safeguarding as a relatively modern concept, but its roots stretch much, much further than you might imagine. So, my plan is to take us on a brief journey through some of the earliest milestones, especially in our understanding and response to the protection of children and vulnerable adults. Now, when we talk about the earliest attention, we're not looking at formal legislation as we know it today. Instead, we see initial stirrings of concern and intervention driven by societal shifts and growing awareness of vulnerability. A great place to start is the Victorian era. Whilst often romanticised, it is also a time of significant social inequality and hardship. Now we've seen regularly the plight of impoverished children and where they're forced into dangerous work environments. Now, this began to capture the public attention, and we're often shown in schools these pictures of dirty back streets and young children sat on steps, or we hear about them working in those factories that essentially led to a number of deaths. Now, one of the pivotal moments in the formal kind of like recognition of child protection came from the Prevention of Cruelty to Children Act of 1889. Now, this was a surprise to me because I didn't really think they had anything this early where they would focus on these kind of things, especially the conditions that we would say that we see a lot within books and in documentaries. But it was spearheaded by the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, which, as we know, is the NSPCC. And this had been founded just a few years prior and was an absolute game changer. For the first time, it provided legal framework to intervene in cases of child abuse and neglect, which clearly was rife at the time. It recognized that children had rights and were entitled to protection from harm. Obviously, it would take another nearly 100 years until actually we came about with children's rights, but that's from another podcast from a few weeks ago if you want to check that out. But this act really laid the groundwork for future child protection efforts. Let's pause for a second so we can take a little look at the NSPC scene, as I believe they have been pivotal in bringing about what is modern legislation and guidance when it comes to safeguarding in the UK. Now, it was inspired by New York's Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. A Liverpudlian businessman, Thomas Agnew, he founded the Liverpool Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Children, which was the LSPCC, and this was in 1883. This sparked the creation of similar organisations across the UK, including the London Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Children in 1884. Now, this was supported by a number of key figures of the day, including a certain Queen Victoria's patron. To any other history buffs like me, you'll know that Queen Victoria wasn't exactly the most maternal of figures, but it seemed to do the job that she was on the board for raising the organisation's profile. As in 1889, these local efforts merged into the National Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Children, which is what we know as the NSPCC today. This, of course, marking a significant step towards national child protection. This pivotal year also saw the NSPCC launch its official publication, The Child's Guardian, and this was a successful campaign for the first time in the UK law, protecting children from abuse and raising awareness, essentially. The national scope for the organisation was further solidified through collaborations with police forces, who, as we know at the time, were still trying to find their feet, essentially. But they came to actually directing any child cruelty cases to the NSPCC at the time. And then it was granted a royal charter in 1895. The NSPCC embarked on a long history of advocating for child welfare and providing essential support services. A mission that continues to evolve in the 21st century as we see it, with initiatives like Childline. Now, Childline is an awesome initiative that has supported so many young people over the years, but will leave their history for another day. Moving into the 20th century, particularly after the Second World War, we saw a growing understanding of the psychological impact of abuse and neglect. Now, you can see that children had gone through a lot during the World Wars, and they'd been moved from place to place with the evacuations. And what essentially was life at the time was very tough. They didn't have much, had either been destroyed or was through rationing, essentially. The Children's Act of 1948 was another significant piece of legislation. Now, this was prompted by social changes after the war, and then, better late than never, but the awareness of the state's duty to care for children, especially those who had lost parents or were vulnerable in other ways. This act focused on providing care and support for these children, establishing local authority children's departments, which I'm sure you're ahead of me already on this one, were the forerunners of today's social services. The focus during this period was largely on children. However, the concept of safeguarding adults began to emerge slowly, but it did, although perhaps less formally. Concerns about the welfare of individuals with mental health issues, learning disabilities, and older people experiencing abuse or neglect were present and often addressed through emerging social care practices and advocacy from various organisations. So essentially, charities had to kind of foot the bill on this one. Now, we're going to shift forward slightly, and we're going to go to the latter half of the 20th century, which saw a series of tragic events which led to public inquiries. And it was those inquiries that actually shaped our understanding of safeguarding failures and the need for more robust systems. Cases of child abuse in institutional settings, for example, brought the issue of safeguarding into stark focus. And we see a lot of that today being replayed, and rightfully so that we don't lose sight of what has actually happened. And this was saw the legal changes, essentially, in the development of more specialised safeguarding procedures. Several harrowing cases have significantly shaped, though, and more so child protection legislation in the UK. Starting with the death of Maria Colwell, for example, in 1973. She was killed by a stepfather after returning home from a foster care, despite numerous warning signs. This triggered a public outcry and then that subsequent inquiry. This highlighted the systemic failure in communication and risk assessment. This contributed to the Children's Act 1975. Now, this emphasised the necessity for the child's welfare and aimed to improve interagency cooperation. Later, the tragic death of Jasmine Beckford in 1984, who suffered fatal abuse after being returned to her parents despite professional concerns, furthermore underscored the need for robust child protection procedures and better information sharing between agencies. These cases, amongst others, directly influenced the development of the Child Act 1989, which was a landmark piece of legislation that established a framework for modern child protection system, emphasising the welfare principle and the importance of partnership working. Sadly, more recently, the horrific death of Victoria Climbié in 2000, this exposed catastrophic failures in the communication and coordination between health, education, and social services. The subsequent inquiry from that led to the significant reforms, most notably the Children's Act 2004. This act placed a duty on various agencies to cooperate to improve the well-being of children and led to the creation of the local Safeguarding Children's Board, which was known as the LSEBs. It's now known as the Safeguarding Partners. And now this was to ensure that a more joined-up approach to safeguarding. Furthermore, the Working Together to Safeguard Children's Guidance, which has been updated several times since its initial publication, has consistently emphasised the need for effective multi-agency working, learning from serious case reviews to prevent future tragedies. And this ensures a more coordinated and child-centred approach to safeguarding. Whilst the initial focus was heavily on child protection, the principles of safeguarding, recognising vulnerability, preventing harm, and responding effectively when it occurs, began to be more broadly applied to adults at risk. This recognition has evolved significantly over time, leading to specific legislation and guidance aimed at protecting vulnerable adults from abuse and neglect in various contexts. So, from the initial, almost philanthropic efforts to protect children in the 19th century to the gradual broadening of scope to include vulnerable adults, the history of safeguarding in the UK is testament to growing societal awareness of our collective responsibility. Amen to that. It is clear to see that those who stand up for the rights of those who are most at risk faced a journey marked with difficulty and hard work, something that a lot of us still today are witnessing ourselves, experiencing. But from these people influence significant legislative milestones driven by that public concern and continuous striving to create safer society for everyone. So have peace in mind that even if you are having pushback or a struggle because you're trying to do something right, keep going, because you could yourself actually be protecting a lot of people in the future. I believe that it's clear from the brief history not only that safeguarding is everyone's responsibility, but we all must continue to fight for what is right, support and protect those who are most vulnerable, and, to coin the phrase we use a lot at Cornerstone Safeguarding, interrupt the potential for harm to occur. Thank you for listening to my brief history of safeguarding in the UK. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit the follow button so you don't miss another episode of Safeguarding Redefined.